Hi, this is Victoria Nalule, and here with me is Mr. Abdul again from Somalia. Today's discussion will focus on the mining industry of Somalia, and Mr. Abdul will be taking us through the legal and institution framework, and we shall also discuss about small-scale mining in Somalia. Mr. Abdul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Abdurahman, and I am originally from Somalia. I have spent the last 30 years of my life in the United States. I work as an attorney in the United States. However, I am a native and citizen of Somalia as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul, for the introduction. And maybe you can tell them about your profession background.
I'm a practicing attorney in the United States. I've had my own law firm for basically about the last 15 years. Currently, at this time, I am completing a master's in law, an LLM in energy law and policy at the University of Dundee, and that has actually afforded me to learn a lot more about the extractive industries, and hopefully I hope to practice law in East Africa. That's where my aim is.
Oh, thank you very much for the introduction. Today we want to focus more on the mining industry, because in our last discussion you clearly took us through the oil and gas sector of Somalia. Could you please give us a brief overview of the mining industry in Somalia?
The mining industry in Somalia, in comparison to the oil and gas industry, is in some ways it's more developed, in other ways it's a lot less developed. When I say it's more developed, that is because there is some production in Somalia, although it's artisanal production. There clearly has been no oil and gas development in Somalia. There's been no production or extraction. So in that sense, the mining sector is ahead of the oil and gas industry. However, with regards to laws, contracts, it's a lot less developed, because the mining sector's primary law comes from the era of governance prior to 1990, when the Civil War started. And thus far it has not really been updated. What's happened though is that in June of this year, there was a meeting of the mines, and there was an agreement that was reached between the central federal government and the member states on the issues of revenue sharing in the extractive industries. And hopefully that now means that there is more cooperation between the federal government and the member states, such that they can now move on to formulating and passing legislation in the parliament that makes it possible for these industries to move forward.
Okay, and what kind of minerals do you have? You didn't tell us the kind of minerals, type of minerals you have in Somalia.
There had been a lot of prospecting done, a lot of surveys done in Somalia. There are a few Somali geologists that have written a lot of material on the mining industry in Somalia, or the mineral resources in Somalia. I know two of them, Dr. Abikar and Dr. Abdisiat in Cape Town. Dr. Abikar works with the Minister of Petroleum, and you know, going on the work product of those two gentlemen and others, we do know that there are, you know, mining deposits, mineral deposits in Somalia that include gold, gypsum, sepalite, and you know, tin, iron ore, and tantalum. Now, there have been some definition of exactly what tonnage exists with regard to those minerals, but I think given the fact that technology has advanced for the last 30 years in the sector, that going forward we'll have a clearer idea of how much or how many deposits within within more exact parameters that we can come to.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very impressive, because we, as he has mentioned, at least we are aware that there are lots of minerals in Somalia, and definitely maybe in future the mineral sector, the mining sector will be able to contribute to the economic development of the country. Moving forward, could you please take us through the legal and institution framework governing the mining sector in Somalia?
In Somalia, the Ministry of Petroleum and Mineral Resources is the entity within the government that has responsibility for the development of these mineral resources. However, pursuant to the provisional constitution, the federal government does not have unfettered powers or discretion for the development of these natural resources. The constitution clearly states, even though it's a provisional constitution, it clearly states that the federal government has to consult with the member states. And let's not forget that, practically speaking, the fact remains that the member state governments have more control over the state, the administration of the states themselves, and no development can possibly take place without the governments of the, or the administrations of the member states cooperating with the federal government in that sector. As I've previously stated, even though the Ministry of Petroleum and Mineral Resources is in charge of the mining sector, the legislation for the mining sector lags behind. There is one mining code for Somalia that comes from, I believe, the early 1980s, and it has not been updated. I do believe that it's a concession type of, it's a law that envisions all contracts to be concession type laws with maybe some rent and some taxation and possibly some royalties involved. However, like I said, it's very possible, and I do believe it will happen, that mineral code itself will be looked at again. It probably will be improved upon and then submitted to the Parliament for review and passage.
Oh, thank you very much. As he has mentioned, I think there is a need for improvement and reform with regard to the legal and institution framework governing the mining sector in Somalia. Moving forward, there have been lots of issues concerning artisanal and small-scale mining in different African countries. As I showed in my previous videos, you saw the situation these miners were going through, the kind of challenges they are facing. And I'd like to pose the same question to Abdul. What is the situation with regard to small-scale mining in Somalia?
The figures that I have come from the U.S. Geological Survey, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Interior, and in one of their publications, I'm not sure if it was 2011 or 2014, they did mention there are about approximately 1,600 people involved in artisanal mining. And for the sake of our viewers, artisanal mining essentially is individual mining, as opposed to companies or corporations coming in to do large-scale mining. Artisanal mining involves subsistence mining, very similar to subsistence farming, where an individual with maybe by themselves or with a very few friends and companions goes out and prospects in a known producing area. When I say known producing area, what I mean is that there is an area where there are some deposits, and they are able to get to those deposits with rudimentary equipment and rudimentary skills. And unfortunately, it's happening because that space has not been filled by corporations or the government.
Okay, thank you very much. In addition, I'd like to add some of the challenges these miners face. First and foremost, due to the use of the rudimentary methods, you'll find that these people are exposed to health and environmental challenges. In my previous video, I showed you what the salt miners in Katwe district in Uganda, what they go through. Like, it's a big challenge for African countries. Like, that's a field artisanal mining and small-scale mining is a field we really need to concentrate on. We need to support the miners besides formalizing this sector, but we also need to see ways of reaching out to these miners, because at the end of the day, this sector employs many poor people in African countries. Moving forward, what I always ask my guests to give advice to the young Africans out there. So last time you gave them advice with regard to the oil and gas sector, and perhaps for the mining sector, you can give us a few words for these viewers.
Well, I actually really liked that last point you made with the subject being, the environmental issues and the danger to the people. And, you have a lot more experience in that field than I do. But both from your work and from others, my understanding is, it's kind of, in some ways, it's a serious situation in Africa, because the people that are engaged in these artisanal mining sometimes use chemicals without protection. And I know from your own projects that you were able to raise some money to donate to people so that they could get gloves and shoes to work in these areas to protect the people from these harmful chemicals that they're using, chemicals like mercury and stuff like that when it comes to mining for gold. Unfortunately, in Somalia, we don't have that kind of, we haven't had anyone do something like that. So when I mentioned 1,600 people involved in these sectors, we're talking about people that are not only employing rudimentary skills and rudimentary equipment, but that are exposing themselves to these chemicals with their, consequences, and also consequences for the environment, because there usually is a runoff from these mining areas that affects water reservoirs and aquifers and that kind of a thing, especially if there are farming areas close by. My biggest concern has always been that where you see artisanal mining, generally there is a failure of government policy, because mining, just like oil and gas law, is a high capital, low employment sector. And so people see companies coming in and mining and taking money out, taking natural resources out, but there usually is not a benefit to the people. So the people come in, sometimes they break into the area where the companies are working, and they take for themselves a sort of a personal tax in production so they can survive themselves. So as I've said, it's in many ways it's a failure of government policy, and in the long run, if it's unchecked, what happens is, because it can cause damage to the mine, because it can interfere with the investors' own rights, in the long term it's not good for the country. What would I advise to the young people? I would advise them to get some education, but I have a bit of a problem in the mining sector as opposed to the oil and gas sector, because in the mining sector where you have artisanal mining, the question is, when you try to tell people don't do this and don't do that, how can you tell somebody, as I sit here comfortably, how can I tell somebody don't engage in artisanal mining when they're actually using that to feed their families? So my advice then would be to mitigate any problems by trying to procure the right equipment to protect yourself, protect your fellow workers, and protect the environment around you by engaging in some responsible mining. And I would advise young people that artisanal mining by itself, it can get you some quick money, especially where people are mining precious gemstones and gold, which is done in Somalia, but in the long term it's not productive, and in the long term it doesn't lead to success. So I would advise the young people, do not be seduced by the short-term benefits of artisanal mining. The better way would be to continue your education, and rise up to a level where you can be the engineers that work in those fields rather than someone who risks their life getting into ditches and scrapping for scraps.
Thank you very much, Abdul, for the wonderful interview and for the wonderful message to the young Africans out there. I'll also add a little bit on artisanal mining. Currently, we've set up an NGO called the African Energy and Mineral Management Initiative. In here, we recognize the fact that artisanal mining is a problem, and we also recognize the fact that there have been several initiatives, both international, national, and region, to reach out to these miners. But in most cases, these are not practical solutions, because we also know we need formalization. We need to see how to take care of these miners. But at the end of the day, these are very poor people, uneducated. So yes, even if they know the challenges and dangers of getting involved in these activities, at the end of the day, if you have hungry family back home, you'll be like, I have no option, I'll do all this. So through our organization, we offer protective equipment to these miners, like gloves, gumboots, and also we do some education, like we teach them what to do, how to protect themselves, and basically just to be there for them, because we need to do something right now until we find a permanent solution. Thank you very much, our viewers. Do not forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. We'll be bringing you more videos concerning the African energy and mining sector. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.